Hi, welcome to today's segment of Our Ventura TV. My name is George Alger. Today we're going to be talking about one of the founding fathers, Thomas Paine, and our guest expert is a Thomas Paine enthusiast, Jeff Harman. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, George. Good to be here.
So who is Thomas Paine?
Thomas Paine was an English-American revolutionary who arrived in America in 1774, a couple years before the Declaration of Independence. And he wrote a book that changed the world.
Yeah, and the title of the book?
Common Sense.
Right, and is that what made him become a founding father, made him become known?
That was his mark on history to begin with. He did a lot of things after that, but Common Sense was published in January 1776 and explained the reasons for why we should declare independence and why we should do it now. And as you know, 6 months later, the Declaration of Independence was signed.
So, do you understand that, is your understanding that his book actually instigated the Declaration, or that this was part of a conversation that was going on and he sort of highlighted it?
At the time, people were torn on what to do. In America, they loved their mother country, England. They loved the empire of England and being English citizens, but they didn't like the taxes and what Parliament was doing. So many people were on the fence. This book changed all that. It was a bestseller for its time. It sold 150,000 copies in just a couple of weeks, which is equivalent to 15 million today.
Wow.
A huge bestseller.
And at that time, how many American books were actually being published?
Well, pamphlets were the way books were published.
Okay.
Simple to make, simple to assemble and sell cheaply. But his pamphlet was skyrocketed as far as selling went. And the key thing about the book was Thomas Paine wrote in a way that people could understand things. So even if you were illiterate, someone could read the book aloud to you and you would understand it. So it was actually widespread more than the actual number of books that were sold. And he didn't take a penny for any of this. He wanted the book out there. So he didn't take any royalties or any payment at all.
Wow, okay, so the book got published, but there was printing costs, so people were paying for the book, or
Yes.
was it actually a book or a pamphlet?
Pamphlet,
Okay.
55 pages in length, very small.
Okay, so people were paying for it, but they're paying a smaller amount than normal for a pamphlet.
Yes.
Okay, good.
In the printing, the printer got paid.
Right. And how is it that he became this author?
This is what happened. He immigrated to America because his life was nothing in England. He was 37 years old when he arrived. Benjamin Franklin, of all people, in England, encouraged him to emigrate. And when he got here, he became an editor and a writer for a Pennsylvania magazine for about a year. And he wasn't decided himself on whether to want independence or stay English. But what changed, the turning point in his life, happened on April 19th, 1775, Lexington, Massachusetts. British redcoats opened fire on some militiamen. 8 were killed. And when he found out about that, the light bulb switched. The line he said was, when I just arrived in America and saw this happen, it was time to stir and get started. 6 months later, Common Sense came out.
Wow. Okay, so speak a little bit more about how this pamphlet or this book affected the colonies.
Well, again, it was very simply written. He had basically 4 points. One was the monarchy itself. He just tore into why the subject of monarchy itself was crazy. How could you just assign powers to someone who's just the son of a king? It just made no sense to him. The fact that England was an island and they're governing over this continent in America, that we should be equal partners at minimum, and we're getting all this abuse from a tyrannical king. It just was outrageous to him. We should be able to stand on our own.
Okay.
And he's laid out how that can come about and how our government should be set up.
Okay. And where did he live?
When he arrived in Philadelphia, 1774,
Okay.
lived there for a time.
So it was easy for him to be connected to the other founding fathers.
Yes, when the war started, he joined the army. He was an aide to one of the generals, And his further influence during the war, this is something that people are familiar with, the first 6 months of the war, we were getting nowhere. Washington and the Army had been driven out of New York, out of New Jersey, and now they're in Pennsylvania. Wanting to do next, this is the winter of 1776. Everybody's defeated. We haven't won anything yet. Washington had this brilliant plan. Let's cross the Delaware, go down to Trenton, attack these German mercenaries that are there, which is what happened. But what encouraged that to happen, Paine wrote what he called his American Crisis, these series of pamphlets he wrote throughout the war. The first one, the first line of the first one, I'm sure you remember, "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington had his commanders read that pamphlet aloud to all his troops 2 days before the attack.
Wow.
To encourage everybody to get involved and raise their spirits. And we know what happened. That was the first major victory. It gave everybody hope that we had a chance against King George.
I've never heard this. So he's a real inspirational point, at an important point. He was an inspirational force at an important point in the war.
And he wrote 15 more of these American Crisis pamphlets throughout the war to keep the war, the spirits going.
Wow, okay. And then these were published through a printer and under his name. Did he also get published through magazines or other periodicals?
Pamphlets were the way to go. They were reprinted throughout the world at the time, these pamphlets. But the trick was finding a printer that would do it, because they were at risk if the British found out. If they found out who he was, Mr. Common Sense, things could have been different.
How did you become such an enthusiast for Thomas Paine?
A few years ago, I was a member of a Toastmasters club. We would give presentations to an audience, and I was looking for something to talk about. Came across a list that was titled 10 Books That Changed America. Number 1 on the list was Common Sense. And at the time, my reaction was similar to reactions I still get today. Oh, I've heard of Common Sense, Thomas Paine, something about the war, some generality about this book. So I read the book, and then read about him and all his exploits and adventures and accomplishments through the war and after the war, and I was just amazed about this man. So that morphed into more presentations about Thomas Paine and his accomplishments, morphed into my dressing up as Thomas Paine, giving presentations as him in his deeds.
So he served in the war and was a writer before and during and probably after the war.
That's right. After the war was won and we were a nation, he went over back to England for something to do with an invention that he had about a bridge. But while there, he got excited about what was going on in France. Their revolution was underway, the French Revolution. He wrote a book called The Rights of Man in England, encouraging the British to get rid of their king, and he was almost arrested and he fled over the channel to France. But that book was all about, again, the evils of a monarchy and why the English should get rid of their king.
Wow.
He couldn't avoid where revolutions were going on. He wanted to get involved because he thought people should have freedoms and rights.
So during the war, of course, all the founding fathers had a target on their head from England. But are you saying that he had a particularly larger target because of writing Common Sense?
Oh, sure, because they knew who he was, and he was always looking over his shoulder. But he was in the army, so he was surrounded by an army, working for a general, so he was in good shape. But after the war, he was free to go to England, and nobody cared. And still, until he wrote another book about revolution.
Yeah, jeez. So he's accomplished quite a bit in his lifetime. What would you say are some of the most interesting things that you'd like the viewers to know?
Well, I'll talk about what got him into trouble. When he was in France, he actually was part of the French Parliament during upheaval there He was part of one of the revolutionary parties there. The king was in jail. They were thinking about beheading the king or not. Anyway, during that time of period, France was going totally secular. And Paine felt obliged to write about what his religious beliefs were. He was a deist. He believed in God. But the book, which is called The Age of Reason, he excoriated the Bible. He just gave his own thoughts, even though he was very tolerant of all religions. He felt people should believe anything they want or not. But this book was so anti-organized religion, it got him into a lot of trouble back home in America. People just wouldn't stand for it. So when he had many adventures in France, but when he eventually came back to America, everybody hated him.
Wow.
And that's why he had no friends anywhere. Quakers would not even let him be buried in their cemetery. 3 people attended his funeral. And when he died, biographies came out anti-Trump, anti-Paine. And he was pretty much a forgotten founding father from that point forward.
Wow.
Just because of that book, for the most part.
Wow, that is pretty amazing. Okay, so personally you feel it's unfair that he did all this good and that has gone somewhat unnoticed because of his thoughts in this area.
Exactly. Even 100 years later, President Theodore Roosevelt still referred to him as the filthy little atheist.
Wow.
Even though that wasn't true, but even that moniker was just did him no good.
Okay. Wow. All right. Well, we're just about out of time. Is there a summating message you'd like to leave the viewers about Thomas Paine or common sense?
My passion is to get the word out of how a wonderful person that Thomas Paine was. So specifically, telling more people about him. And I'm a part of organizations that are trying to get a monument to him in either D.C. or Philly, because there's nothing there, which is amazing in itself. The city of monuments, Washington, D.C., has nothing for Thomas Paine, which is just unjust.
Yeah. Do you want to mention the name of this organization?
It's the Thomas Paine National Historical Association in New York. But there's other ones that are joining the groups to get this moving.
Okay.
It's just all about funding, but it's something that we're all passionate about.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you, George.
This is George Alger signing off for this segment of Our Ventura TV. Until we meet again.